I call to order this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. Today's topic is Turkey at the Crossroads. What do these protests mean for democracy in the region, and what does it mean for Turkey? After I and the ranking member, Keating, each take 5 minutes to make opening statements, each member present will have 1 minute for opening remarks, alternating between majority and minority members. And without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to length and limitation rules. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Turkey is a NATO ally whose strategic and geographic location is as important as ever. And I remember during the Cold War when Turkey was absolutely essential to the security of the United States and, yes, the peace of the world. Over the past decade, the orientation of Turkish foreign policy under Prime Minister Erdogan has been troubling. Its shift in alignment away from our friends in the Middle East and towards Syria and Iran has increased tensions in the region. The policy called "No Troubles with Neighbors" has been applied to the new engagements with Syria and Iran, but the opposite has taken place with Israel. Erdogan embraces Hamas leadership, for example, for its seizure of power in Gaza, and the Iranian leadership for its, quote, right to a nuclear program. He has supported the infamous Gaza flotilla that tried to run supplies to the Hamas terrorists. The Syrian civil war has caused Prime Minister Erdogan to move backwards toward the West and face the menace of an Iranian Hezbollah intervention. As requested, the U.S. and NATO have deployed Patriot air defense systems in Turkey. So all of this is having its impact. The Turks are Sunni Muslims and have a natural sympathy for the Sunni rebels in Syria, who are fighting a dictatorship rooted in a minority cult associated with Shia Islam. Yet sympathy has not kept Erdogan's policy of supporting the rebels and accepting refugees from being controversial at home, at least. If the Obama administration is serious about increasing U.S. aid to the rebels, it will have to work with Turkey, as it has been doing. But who exactly are the Turks supporting in this? What type of people are we talking about? Are the people that are being helped by Turkey in the Syrian conflict people who, do they hate the United States? And how reliable a partner do we have now in Turkey if they are indeed allying themselves with these anti-American elements? Mass protests over local issues have shaken the Erdogan administration, and its resort to a harsh crackdown on dissidents helped spread popular anger. And let us note that up until now, we have seen, and I have personally seen, Turkey as an example of what I would say moderate Islam in a changing world. And some of the crackdown that we've seen, and of course this situation in Syria and some of these other alliances leave some serious questions, which is the reason why we're having this hearing today. Of course, cracking down on demonstrators leads to worse situations, as we have found out in the West. And Prime Minister Erdogan's loyalists have, of course, unfortunately, and this is not true of the Prime Minister himself, I'm sure, but have resorted to wild conspiracy theories blaming the Jewish lobby and the American Enterprise Institute for the demonstrations taking place in their own country. The Prime Minister himself has referred to the interest rates lobby, which is, or at least can be easily translated as a slur against Jews. Such tactics call into question the character of the ruling party of Turkey. And when I say call into questions, it doesn't answer it, but it calls into questions. And that's why we are having this hearing today, to explore some of those questions and find out, maybe calm some of the fears, or perhaps maybe reconfirm some of the other fears that we've had. There have been reports that anti-Semitic textbooks have been adopted in public schools in the last 10 years, and that Hitler's Mein Kampf has become some kind of a bestseller. Well, this is not a sign of a healthy democracy. And yesterday it was reported that in the capital of Ankara, police raided some 30 residential addresses to arrest protesters at home, going well beyond just confronting demonstrators in the streets in order to maintain public order. The European Union has postponed talks on Turkey's request for membership until at least October because of the concerns, and most strongly these concerns are being voiced by Germany, and they will, of course, when these talks resume, we'd hope to find at that point the situation could have calmed down in Turkey, and we would be able to find out the true nature of what's happening. Our hearing will look at whether Turkey can meet the challenges that face it at home and abroad, and what challenges are being faced by the Erdogan government itself, and what are the potential impacts on these challenges and the way they are met on the interests and values of the people of the United States. To help us answer these questions, we have a distinguished panel, including a veteran diplomat, experts on Turkish society and history and on Islam, and a journalist who's been covering the protests on the ground. What we do not have is anyone from the State Department, and we requested that states send someone, but their response was that the department, quote, wanted to keep its public powder dry, end of quote. So maybe they're trying to assess the situation as well. And so what the Obama administration thinks of events and how it will react will remain a mystery, perhaps to them as well as us. And let me just close by saying this. This hearing is not intended to be a beat-up Turkey hearing. We actually have some very serious questions and concerns about what's going on, the direction of the country. As I say, in the not-so-distant past, I looked at Turkey as perhaps a great example of moderate Islamic government and how it could do good things and could be relied on to promote progress and peace and stability. Now, after the events and what's been going on, what some of the things that have been disclosed, there are serious questions, and today I hope to have those questions answered. And now I would turn to our ranking member for whatever opening statement you would like to make, for as long as you'd like to make it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding these hearings today. Turkey has been a U.S. ally in an incredibly rough neighborhood for many decades now. For this reason, the political stability and economic strength of Turkey is a matter of importance to many American policymakers, analysts, and business people. The membership of Turkey in the Group of 20, along with its growing trade partnerships throughout the region, are positive developments, not only for Turkey, but also for U.S. national interest. Further, the recent news of enhanced prospects for normalization of relationships between Israel and Turkey, as well as the long overdue peace accord with the Kurds, is welcomed. However, it's domestic politics that have now taken center stage in Turkey. The electoral dominance of Prime Minister Erdogan's AK party for more than a decade has led to the emergence of a seemingly one-party state. Other parties have little to no ability to influence decision-making, and that's left many Turks feeling threatened, frustrated, and powerless. These feelings are exacerbated by the Prime Minister's self-acknowledged majoritarian philosophy, namely that a government elected with a parliamentary majority has no post-election obligation to consult the governed. However, what most caught the eye of this subcommittee and the world has been the Prime Minister's seeming sanctioning of brute force by the police against peaceful protesters. In the last few weeks, 5 people have died. Some 4,900 plus protesters have been detained, and 4,000 people were injured. There are countless reports of arrests of doctors treating injured bystanders, young adults using social media to express their frustrations, and lawyers attempting to defend the fragile rule of law. Further, the rhetoric of the Turkish government has inflamed the situation, as the Prime Minister publicly praises the police and repeatedly distinguishes between those that support him and those who do not. For this reason, I'm pleased that President Obama, Vice President Biden, and Secretary Kerry have made responsible statements calling the Turkish government to account, and I commend them for that. I will speak for myself when I say that following years of mostly astute governance in Turkey, the Turkish government's response to the recent protests came not only as a disappointment, but as a surprise, frankly. As we sit here today, the protests continue on, with the Turkish Interior Ministry reporting at least 2.5 million protesters over the past 3+ weeks. In fact, these numbers and the sheer diversity of the protesters represents hope for the reemergence of a vibrant, politically engaged generation of Turks that embrace pluralism. If so, the energy of these demonstrations could well become the basis for a reinvigorated, dynamic democracy. That is not a development Mr. Erdogan should fear, but rather he should welcome. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' perspectives on this developing situation and thank especially those who have traveled from Turkey to share their views here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Duncan has an opening statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as a friend of Turkey, I appreciate you holding these hearings on what the protests mean for democracy in the region. I remember just 2 short years ago, you and I were in Turkey observing the parliamentary elections in June of 2011, if my memory serves me correctly. So watching the political dynamics going on in Turkey right now are something that are interesting to me, and I enjoyed a conversation I had this morning about these very issues, and I look forward to a follow-up on that, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much for that opening statement, and let us just note that 2 years ago there was that election. We were there, and everyone was deeply impressed that Turkey was having an honest and open and free election, and how people were engaged and involved. And that was a very impressive sight for those of us who knew what turmoil was going on in the rest of the area. And now, of course, today, we have a different vision of what's happening in Turkey. So that's why we need to discuss it. And we have 5 very knowledgeable witnesses with us today that can help us in this discussion. James Jeffrey served as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 2008 to 2010. Prior to that appointment, he had served as Deputy Chief of Mission from 2004 to 2005 in Iraq. And he returned and served as Secretary of State's Condoleezza Rice's Special Advisor on Iraq. And so what we have is with Mr. Jeffrey is a very, how do you say, very experienced man, and also I seem to remember that you were in Iraq when I got kicked out of Iraq that last time. We'll leave that. I'll leave that's it. We also have Dr. Hillel Fradkin.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add, I was with you on that trip when we were kicked out of Iraq too, Ambassador. So,
Mr. Chairman, may I say I was not with you?
All right. And Dr. Hillel Fradkin, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute and directs its Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World. He co-founded and co-edits the Journal on Current Trends in Islamic Ideology, the leading journal devoted to the study of contemporary Islam. And we appreciate him being with us today. We have with us Kadir Ustan. He is the research director of the Stata Foundation here in Washington and assistant editor of Insight Turkey, the foundation's academic journal. Mr. Ustan holds a PhD in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies from Columbia University, where he was also taught at that university. Kadri Crisel is a contributing writer for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse and has written a column for the Turkish daily Milliyet, and he's done that since 2007. He focuses primarily on Turkish foreign policy, the Kurdish question, and Turkey's evolving political Islam. He has joined the Milliyet Publishing Group in 1997 after working as a correspondent, and it says 1995 he was kidnapped by the Kurdish PKK insurgents, and I'm sure and it's a tale that he's recounted in a book. We should all maybe take a look at that. It sounds like an exciting adventure in your life, perhaps one that you don't think back on quite fondly. And the name of his book is Those of the Mountains. We also have with us Sonia, and I'm going to see if I can pronounce this. Could you help me with that? Kechuchape. And he is the Bayer Family Fellow and Director of Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He earned his PhD in history from Yale University and has taught courses on the Middle East at Yale, Princeton, Georgetown, and Smith College. And he has also served as chair of the Turkey Advanced Area Studies Program for the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. Thank you all for being with us.
You'll be our first person to speak to.
Did I miss somebody?
No. The one you just, Chapter will be our first witness to speak to.
Okay, and you will be our first witness. We're starting, thank you, Bill, for getting me straight on that. So we will start there, and then each of you would be given a 5 minutes to present some testimony. We'd appreciate if you keep it around 5 minutes, and then we will follow up by questions, and appreciate, as I say, appreciate keeping it to about 5 minutes. If you have more extensive remarks than that, they will be placed in the record at this point in the hearing. Thank you very much, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to testify today on the recent protests in Turkey, what they mean for democracy in Turkey, the country's neighborhood, and for U.S. policy. The following is a summary of my prepared remarks, which I have submitted for the written record. Turkey, as you said, is an important country. It's a NATO member state. It's a key ally for the United States. Situated between Central Asia, Caucasus, the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Middle East, it is vital to U.S. interests across those regions. Take, for instance, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Turkey is the only country that borders these three nations and is vital for U.S. policy towards these nations. That is why I think it's important for us to look at the recent domestic developments in Turkey, because according to most analysts, the recent protests that rocked Istanbul and other cities for almost a month represent what is probably the biggest challenge that the governing Justice and Development Party in Ankara has faced in over power since it came to government in 2002. So what do these protests mean for Turkey's stability, for democracy in Turkey, for Turkey's region in the Middle East, and obviously for U.S. policy? I'd start with Turkey's dramatic transformation under the AKP. Since this party came to power in 2002, Turkey has become, thanks to AKP's sound economic policies, a wealthy country with a majority middle-class society. This is a first in Turkish history. As a result of this transformation, Turkey has joined the prestigious member of G20 club of nations, and it has also become a powerhouse in the Middle East. As a result of this dramatic transformation, the country, as I said earlier, has become a majority middle-class society. And ironically, I think the protests show that the AKP is perhaps a victim of its own success. The middle class that the party's policies have created is now committed to individual freedoms and is taking issue with the governing party's style of governance and its attempts at political domination. This suggests that the often cited modernization theory, that as countries develop and become more prosperous, they become better democracies, is being validated in Turkey. We're seeing the rise of a middle class that demands respect for individual freedoms, freedom of expression, assembly, media, and association, as well as minority and individual rights. I think this is, in a nutshell, this is what encapsulates the developments in Turkey. Allow me now to look at, Mr. Chairman, what I think the developments do not constitute. I don't think the developments constitute yet another episode of the Arab Spring. Turkey did not experience the proverbial winter, political winter. Therefore, the country was and is a democracy. So the Arab Spring analogy does not quite apply. Nor did the protests suggest a significant weakening of the AKP. By most measures, about half of the country's population still supports the governing party. The protests are also not about a manifestation of the secular Islamist divide that has for so long dominated Turkish politics. Although most of the protesters are secular, their demands are not about secularism per se. They're about the quality of democracy and demand for liberal values. Mr. Chairman, I believe that these demonstrations present a new dynamic in Turkish politics. The members of the protest movement, roughly representing half of the Turkish electorate, have found strength in numbers. They've also found that they can continue and sustain their demonstrations thanks to the organizing force of social media technologies. These are indeed this is indeed a new dynamic in Turkish politics in the sense that the protests represent Turkey's first massive grassroots political movement that is likely to sustain itself. This new form of political force in Turkish politics could obviously complicate Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan's political agenda. Among those issues I'd like to cite is Turkey's Syria policy, which you have looked at, Mr. Chairman. Although most Turks do not support Bashar al-Assad, many are also unnerved by Ankara's policy, which they think has exposed Turkey to increased risks and costs. Take, for instance, a recent attack, a terror attack, unfortunate attack on Turkish town of Reyhanli that killed 51 people that took place in May. This is the worst attack Turkey has suffered in modern history. Accordingly, I think this persistent opposition is likely to move Ankara to a position of leading from behind in Syria. Turkey's relationship with the U.S., I don't think will suffer much from the unrest. Ankara values its relationship with Washington, and I think that the rapport Prime Minister Erdogan shared with President Obama is going to help resolve any wrinkles that will arise from Washington's criticism of Ankara's conduct. Still, the issue remains. Turkey is divided deeply between the supporters and opponents of the governing party, and the recent protests may have deepened this chasm further. The secular, middle-class, liberal Turks are demanding respect for freedom of the press, expression, association, and assembly, as well as a voice on environmental policy and urban space. I think the Turkish leadership should take comfort in the fact that the demonstrations are not directly against AKP. Rather, they're for individual rights and better democracy. The leadership should also avoid giving credit to widespread conspiracy theories that the demonstrations are driven by quote-unquote outside forces. Millions of people have demonstrated in over 78 Turkish cities over the course of a month. This is clearly an indigenous Turkish movement, and the country's government would be better served to listen to it, embracing democracy. In this regard, I think Brazil is a case in point. Mr. Chairman, I think at this juncture, the way forward for Turkey overlaps with U.S. policy and U.S. interests in the Middle East. Turkey has become an economic power in the region. It has become a soft power nation, and it wants to be a leader in the Middle East. And Ankara wants Washington to treat it as such. I would say that as far as U.S. policymakers are concerned, Turkey can become a leader in the Middle East only if it shines as an example of liberal democracy. To this end, the Turkish government and people will be well served to embrace broad individual liberties, including freedoms of assembly, association, media, and expression. At the moment, Turkey is attempting to draft its first civilian-made constitution, and this presents Ankara and all the Turks with a unique opportunity to do so, recognize those liberties, and do so without restrictions. What is good for Turkey is also good for the Middle East and the United States, Mr. Chairman. Turkey can overcome its political tensions by adopting a constitution that respects individual freedoms and recognizes its diversity. This would also mark an important milestone for the country's desire to become a source of inspiration for other Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. Only if Turkey seizes this opportunity, it can become a partner Washington can be proud to have in the region. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the takeaway of today's conversation and our message to our ally Turkey, the country's citizens and its neighbors should be the following. Democracy is not just about the right to be equal, it is also about protecting the right to be different. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for that very thoughtful testimony, and I'd like to now turn to Ambassador Jeffrey for some thoughts from him. And last witness was fairly optimistic for the long run, and we're very interested in your views on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Keating, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'll submit my longer statement for the record and just summarize a certain number of points. First of all, my colleague at the Washington Institute, Sona Chaptai, has laid out, I think, a very accurate and optimistic, but again, realistic view of how we should go forward and how Turkey will probably go forward. I'll just touch on a few domestic issues that I would like to highlight and then get to what the U.S. should do and some of the implications for the region. First of all, I do think that this does demonstrate that there is a large fissure in Turkish society between two relatively large groups, and this is being fought out on various levels. But that's okay because that's how democratic countries evolve, and we've seen this in East Asia, we've seen this in Central and Southern America. Many of you have gone on visits to these countries as they're moving forward, and they do this step by step. This is what's happening in Turkey. The concern that we all have with the reaction of the government is, first of all, as it came out in a statement from the White House just yesterday after President Obama called Prime Minister Erdogan, is the concern about the violence of the reaction of the authorities against the demonstrators, and the concern about freedom of expression, freedom of demonstration, and freedom of media. All of these have been called into question to one or another degree by some of the statements and actions by the government, and that's of concern. But in particular, the polarization of those people who are opposed to the government is troubling. From our standpoint, looking from the outside, first of all, Mr. Chairman, this is not going to lead to the overthrow or the fall of the Erdogan government, certainly not before the elections of 2015, and I think the government is still maintaining probably a majority. But what it does portend is trouble for a country that is integrated ever more into the advanced world with its trade, with its diplomatic and military relationships, and NATO with the European Union and so forth, and a country that needs good relations with the outside, be it tourism, be it, again, its trade. Some of that has already suffered because of the demonstrations. There are other aspects of that, including the recent decisions by the Federal Reserve, but the stock market did fall dramatically. The lira has also fallen against the dollar, and there's some indication that tourism and foreign direct investment may be challenged. But more importantly, the majority can rule in Turkey like in any other country. It can issue orders to the police. It can pass laws. But it cannot control the minority. And in the end, there has to be some kind of relationship between those people who are not part of the governing coalition and the governing coalition to have stability in any country. We dealt with this in our own constitutional process in the 18th century between those in favor of a majority rule and those in favor of minority rights. Turkey is going to have to go through this. It is a democracy. For the moment, I think we can trust in the Turkish people to work their way through this. But meanwhile, what should we do, and what is the attitude of the U.S. government? Obviously, coming from a diplomatic background, I like to do diplomatic talks in private rather than in public, but there's a role for a public discourse as well, both from the government and from institutions like the Congress, speaking out about our values when we see them being challenged. But nonetheless, where the United States can help the most, because we do have a good relationship with the Erdogan government, is in private conversations, and that's apparently exactly what President Obama did yesterday in his conversation. Coach the Turks on our view of why a continued clashes in Turkey are not good for Turkey's future, are not good for Turkey's economy, and are not good for Turkey's role in the region. And that's the thing I want to leave with, Mr. Chairman. This region is in a worse condition than I've seen it in many decades, for many reasons, including some decisions we perhaps made. But at the end of the day, if we're going to find a way forward with Syria, with Iraq, and with Iran, as my colleague and as you people have pointed out, we're going to have to use our good relations with Turkey. We're going to have to cooperate and coordinate fully with Turkey, and that requires some kind of relationship with this government. That means that we have to be cautious in what we say publicly. We can be more open privately, and we'll be more effective. I think that's the way the administration is going, but I hope it continues on this, not ignoring the problems, but putting them in the context of an extremely dangerous and big agenda that we have in the region right now, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we'd go to Mr. Houston now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for inviting me to speak at this hearing. I've already submitted my testimony and I will only highlight some of the points discussed there in detail. Today what we see in Turkey is the growing pains of democracy. The crux of the issue is somewhat paradoxical. We have the most successful and reformist political party in power for more than a decade. However, there are certain segments of the society who are frustrated with some policies but cannot express their discontent through the regular channels of formal politics because of the absence of a viable opposition. The basic dynamics of the protests are fundamentally different from the Arab revolutions where there was no meaningful representation of the popular will. The challenge will be for Turkey to accommodate the legitimate demands and aspirations of many Turkish youths. If it succeeds, Turkish democracy will be even stronger in the years ahead and serve as a democratic inspiration for the broader region. The protests can be likened to Occupy Wall Street movement rather than the Arab revolutions. The disproportionate use of force by the police against a small group of protesters occupying the Gezi Park quickly snowballed into much larger protests. Protests are much more similar to those in the West and in the US. 3 major groups have participated in these protests. The biggest one has been the middle and upper class urbanites angry about the Gezi Park redevelopment project and certain policies. These policies resulted in this divisive controversy similar to those over stem cell research, abortion, and gun control in the US and Europe. The second most significant group is the young CHP supporters and the ultra-nationalist wing of the party. Young people are increasingly disenchanted by the political system as they see no hope of challenging the dominant ruling party in the absence of a strong leadership. The CHP is split on how to approach the government's initiative to resolve the Kurdish question. Discontent created by the lack of representation and the Kurdish settlement process, as well as the Syria policy, is a major motivator for this group of demonstrators. The last group is the marginal leftist groups, some of which are illegal organizations implicated in various terrorist attacks, including the bombing attack on the US Embassy in Ankara in February. The government tried to make a distinction among these 3 groups. We can discuss how successful that was. And it promised to listen to the legitimate demands of the protesters about the Gezi Park. But the Prime Minister's harshest words were directed against the 3rd group, which engaged in violence and vandalism. The Prime Minister met the protesters in person, had a long 4-hour meeting, and announced that the government would respect the current court injunction blocking the project. If the court decides to remove the injunction, the government will still hold a referendum. However, the protesters announced that they would continue to occupy the park and hold demonstrations, resulting in further police action. As its efforts to reach out and provide an apology to peaceful protesters proved insufficient, the government viewed the continuation of protests as ill-intentioned. The government argues that the marginal groups and CHP members are orchestrating a campaign to undermine the democratically elected government by taking to the streets. Hence, the government's repeated references to the ballot box as the ultimate jury. It doesn't refer to a majoritarian understanding of democracy, but rather a past where non-political, extra-political powers could wield influence over the elected governments. The protests have resulted in a lively debate throughout the political spectrum about basic rights and freedoms and what an advanced democracy should look like. Turkey's takeoff over the past decade created a new generation of young people who are much more educated, economically comfortable, and increasingly globalized. Their aspirations, frustrations, and discontent cannot fully be expressed in the political scene through the existing opposition parties. The AK Party will need to engage this segment of the protesters. The same goes for the CHP. The struggle between the hardline ultranationalists and the moderates is pulling the party apart. The CHP will have to transform itself into a center-left party or it will find itself fighting the wars of a bygone era. The US-Turkey relationship is important not only for bilateral relations, but also for stability and peace in the broader Middle East. Turkey has a critical relevance for US foreign policy issues, including withdrawal from Afghanistan, stability in Iraq, resolving the Iranian nuclear issue, and ending the Syrian conflict, as well as achieving peace between Israel and Palestine. Turkey has proven time and again it's a dynamic democracy with a vibrant civil society despite its flaws and imperfections. The debate today is not on whether to have democracy, but on how to create a better one that embraces all segments of the society. That is testament to the country's commitment to democratic ideals and the rule of law. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful testimony. And Mr. Fradkin, please.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, honorable members, let me begin by thanking you for the opportunity to testify today. The topic, The topic, Turkey at a crossroads, what do the Gezi Park protests mean for democracy in the region, is a most important one, and I'm therefore very honored to have been invited to offer a response to this and the related questions cited in the invitation. The latter largely focus on the meaning of these events for the prospects of Turkish democracy itself. And all these questions are indeed related because it has been hoped that the fact of Turkish democracy and its successful operation would serve as a model for democratic development in other parts of the Middle East region. This has been especially true since the advent of the so-called Arab Spring and the overthrow of authoritarian regimes. It has also been especially true since the rise to rule of Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and his AKP party. For the latter, as I think both the chairman and the ranking member indicated, appear to offer a model for the successful navigation of the tensions between democracy and Islam. I have submitted more extensive and formal remarks. What follows is a summary. So what does Gezi Park mean? Alas, from the perspective of both Turkish democracy and broader regional hopes, the events surrounding Gezi Park are discouraging. This is because Gezi Park has brought to a head a crisis in the course of Turkish democracy. This crisis has been brewing for some time and has entailed a variety of particular issues and disputes. But the crisis is broader and deeper because it is about democracy as such, what it is and what it should be. Gezi Park reveals that Turkey has not resolved this dispute for itself, at least not yet. And for that reason, it is thus hardly in a position to serve as a model for others. Still less is this the case, since the position of Prime Minister Erdogan, his party, and his government concerning the meaning of democracy, at least as enunciated recently, is a defective one, both from the point of view of Turkey and other states in the region. This has become clear in the aftermath of Gezi Park through both the words and actions of Prime Minister Erdogan, his colleagues, and supporters. In brief, he has insisted on what one may call, and I think the chairman already did call, a majoritarian understanding of democracy. Erdogan claims no more than a majority of 51%, a figure derived from the last elections. Still, he claims that this gives him the right to do as he pleases. For him, this is true for the additional reason that he claims to have made a great success of Turkey over the past decade, and therefore knows what is best for Turkey now and in the future. All the more should he be free to do as he thinks best. But what about the large number of the Turkish public who apparently did not vote for him nor support him? Since Gezi Park, Erdogan has given a very large number of speeches which provide his understanding of them. They are, according to him, terrorists and traitors in league with foreign enemies. Their malevolent intent is to hold Turkey down and back, this are directly quotes, from the still greater Turkish future Erdogan intends to build. He has promised in menacing tones to uncover these alleged plots and punish all those responsible, employing the full powers of the state. If that violates the strict rule of law, so be it. And I want to stress the rhetoric of Prime Minister Erdogan has been really ferocious. Gezi Park was from the beginning an instance of this view. Much has been made of the force and violence used to suppress the original small band of tree-loving demonstrators. And this is important. It was what prompted many more people to come to Taksim Square, which led to still more force and violence. But it is also important to note that the original demonstrators were attempting to block what was in fact an illegal act. The question of Gezi Park was actually in litigation, and a Turkish court had issued a stay on all work there. Still, Erdogan went ahead. In part, the Gezi Park protests were an objection to this kind of high-handed and lawless behavior, which has become all too frequent in recent years. But Erdogan is in part right. The protesters also object to his vision of the Turkish future, and they think they should at least have a say in the matter. This is hardly surprising, for it appears that what Erdogan has in mind is a kind of refounding of the Turkish Republic. He's very attached to the year 2023, when it will celebrate its 100th anniversary, a refounding which entails somehow or other a revival of its pre-Republican past, morally, religiously, and politically. This pre-Republican past, its obviously Ottoman past, was not notably democratic, or rather was based on the will of the rulers. Thus, to many, I think, people in Turkey, Erdogan's behavior and vision appear to be all of a piece. Let me turn to the questions external to Turkey's domestic politics, the regional questions, and end with that. Concerning the region, it is easy to see that the implications are not promising. The region, and especially the Arab countries, have an altogether too rich and deep experience of the politics of will, of an authoritarian will. What it needs, what it has needed, what it still needs, is some model of consensual democratic politics with some due accommodation of religious sensibilities. For a while, it seemed and was hoped that Turkey could provide that, but that is hardly the case today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you for that testimony, and Mr. Grisel.
Respected members of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats, I thank you for the opportunity to share my observations and thoughts on the meaning of the protest movement that started as a reaction to a police action on May 31. So my observations go a bit beyond those of a veteran journalist. They are also personal, as I live very close to the epicenter of the protest at Taksim Square. I myself suffered from the gas that police used so generously on the demonstrators. The first question that must be answered here is what actually happened in Istanbul on May 31 and June, and how to explain it. The shortest way to define it would be that it was a social eruption or social explosion. The excessively harsh police intervention against a few hundred protesters in the early hours of May 31 was the final move that led to this explosion. How did this event swell and reach the point of an explosion? And here is a short list of factors that contributed to the eruption. First of all, the inability of the mainstream media, which was under stiff government pressure, to carry out its basic mission of informing the public and keeping tabs on the government. On the other hand, let me underline the growing importance of the internet media, and especially that of almonitor.com, where I am a contributing writer, to contest this unabashed self-censorship by providing Turkish writers of different perspectives a forum to share their views in both Turkish and English. The independence of the judiciary has been discarded as a result of the accumulation of power never before seen during periods of civilian rule in Turkey, which is the second factor. Most of the public feels that judiciary has been politicized and that ways to seek justice has been blocked. The third one, arbitrary and prolonged political detentions further decrease confidence in the justice system. The fourth is the role of religion in basic education has greatly increased, particularly in the last year, alienating many of Turkey's Alevites and secular citizens. The fifth is, over the last few months, authorities became intolerant of even minor protests and resorted to police violence to disperse them systematically. The sixth is Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's advice to women at every opportunity, it seems, on how many children they should have and how they should give birth has fostered the perception of interference in personal lives. Finally, the government imposed alcohol bans in May under the label of regulating alcohol, causing a sizable part of society to feel that the government was intervening in their lifestyles and freedoms. To keep this short list, which is a very short list, we must also add the Prime Minister's habit of using offensive language to denigrate the cultures and lifestyles of those who are not counted as his constituents. It was Prime Minister Erdogan's policies and pressure he brought to bear on the public with his narratives that led to this social explosion. How then to analyze the sociopolitical chemistry of this explosion? The uprising was a spontaneous popular movement without an organization and leadership. The lead actor in this movement is the well-educated, urbanized young generation labeled by the Turkish media as the 90s generation. Most of these young people place themselves outside of established politics. According to polls, they cite restrictions on their freedoms, Erdogan's authoritarianism, and police brutality as the main reason behind their taking to streets. What they demand most is their freedoms and ending the violations of their rights. To sum up, this is a new secular urban middle classes rebellion against Erdogan's rule. In sum, the social movement that began at Gezi Park, discussed finding ways to defend their freedoms politically. Now, actually, this discussion is continuing in various formats today. Since June 17, activists have been engaged in standstill protests in acts of passive disobedience. Every evening they organize synchronized forums in various Istanbul parks where free debate takes place. The enrichment of the culture of democracy and spreading it to the masses where it will take root is a priceless and never before seen civil society movement. For civil society to take its due place as a key actor in the struggle for democracy is a sign of maturity and a healthy society. Naturally, as I tried to explain at the beginning, this civil social movement is a reaction of anger and resentment against Erdogan government's Islamic conservatism, its policies that are sidestepping democratic freedoms in Turkey. Prime Minister Erdogan's policies of societal polarization did not cost anything until May 31. But from now on, Mr. Erdogan will pay something for his policies of polarization. That price will be instability. The social explosion in Turkey and government pressures that followed simply washed out the paradigm of Turkey model based on the rule of the Justice Development Party. This was advocated as a model for the Middle East and was accompanied by the term Muslim democracy, even though it was not applicable. AKP rule now has two roads to choose from. It has come to a junction. It can finally take the steps needed for Turkey to become a real libertarian, pluralist, participatory, and secular democracy, and as such redefine the Turkey model, but correctly this time, or it can continue to drag Turkey toward an Islamic, authoritarian, and oppressive regime. If AKP officials opt for the latter, they can't advance their cause without suppressing civil society. A more oppressive and more authoritarian regime cannot maintain stability in Turkey. To finalize, it is impossible to give an unequivocal answer to a question frequently asked nowadays, whether a military coup is among the risks to be faced should Turkey destabilize even further. With the purges of 2010-2012, the ability of the military to stage coups has been made extraordinarily difficult. The military has been totally excluded from politics. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful testimony and for the testimony of all of our witnesses today. I'm going to take a little poll. Maybe you could just tell me, before this upheaval happened and this violence started in the park, before the police waded in with their billy clubs and ignited something, did you predict, did you believe that there was a tension and a seething underneath the surface in Turkey that was of the magnitude that we have seen manifest itself since that ignition point. Did you think that this could happen? Just give me a yes or no, Mr. Ambassador.
Yes.
Yes.
Not the timing. Not the timing.
What was that now?
Yes, but not the timing.
Yes, but not, okay, go ahead.
Yes for the resentment, no for the timing.
Yes, with some objections.
Oh, my gosh. All right, thank you for that. I will have to tell you, I didn't. So you guys are a lot smarter than over there and than those of us who are up here. That's why we're having you testify. I really saw, perhaps it was an illusion, and perhaps it was not. It seemed to me that we had a demonstration of Islamic democratic government that was reasonable and could again serve as a model and was reaching out to its own people in the democratic process. I always looked at for example, the fact that women before, and correct me if I'm wrong, were not permitted to wear headscarves when the old pro-military regime was in. And freedom is when a woman has the right to wear a headscarf, but also the right not to wear a headscarf. And if the new government, or if the Erdogan government would then move to the point that it was mandating that, well, then it would begin, as you were mentioning, traipsing on the fundamental freedoms of the people. Was this alcohol restriction? I've heard one example of that. Are there other restrictions that I have missed that were being, again, over the line where you would say that a freedom line that the Erdogan administration was having, other than restricting alcohol is because of someone's religious beliefs? Islam does not believe in that. So were there other restrictions that causing the people to be upset? Whoever has an answer for that? Mr. Ambassador, any?
Simply to say, in our own country, sir, as you know, we prohibited alcohol for many years. As an imbiber of alcohol, I'm personally not in favor of that. But I just want to show how complicated democracy is as it rubs up against what people see as their personal freedoms. And thus, I would segregate this from religion in general, or the specific religion of Islam, and simply state that this struggle between totalitarian or authoritarian thought processes, even with a majority government, and minority rights, we've seen all over the world in many different kind of countries, as countries, including many of our allies, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, evolve, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, did we see in this regime for the last 10 years, was there a violation of people's freedom of speech, for example? Mr. Ustan?
Houston, yes. There are no laws that were passed about restricting freedom of speech in Turkey, and there are very harsh criticism of the government in newspapers and TVs and everywhere. There's been concerns about media issues, but there are structural problems that date back to the 90s and before, where the relationship between sort of big media conglomerates and the businesses, those kind of relationships make the media sort of journalists' lives a little more difficult, because they have to kind of sort of go along with what their bosses want. In the past, they would call on the military to intervene, but today they're doing other things.
Does anyone else have an observation about freedom of speech under this administration? Yes, sir, and then we'll go with you.
I will defer to the Turkish journalist.
Okay. Well, let me give you an example on that. Since 2008, I don't remember having read any news story covering government corruption in the mainstream media. Since 2008.
Is that right?
In the mainstream. So
is that because they've eliminated all government corruption?
So it means, does it mean that Turkey, there is no corruption existing? I don't think so. And then the main instinct replaced the instinct of news in the news desk, is the self-censorship. And it was proven on the night of May 31, when there was a historical events in Istanbul streets, a few hundred meters away. TV channels were broadcasting. One TV channel was broadcasting a live debate about schizophrenia, and the other one was, broadcasting a serial or document on penguins.
Let's just note for the record that
interrupting the
let me just note for the record, I did ask for some recommendations from the Turkish embassy, and they were very gracious in recommending at least one witness for us today, and I appreciate that very much, who they thought would be adding to the discussion, and that witness has added to the discussion. Are there journalists in jail right now? And then I'll have one more question and go to my ranking member. Are there journalists in jail right now in Turkey? Yes.
May I again answer this question, please? Because I am IPI National Committee Chairman, and I am a press freedom activist also.
All right.
And there are more than 60 journalists now in jail in Turkey.
Say that again, Nick.
60 journalists.
60?
More than 60. And they are mostly pro-Kurdish journalists. They are mostly pro-Kurdish journalists. And there is a discussion on them. Maybe Mr. Üstün can answer, I don't know. But there are, according to OSCE and other international organizations defending freedom of the press, there are more than 60 journalists.
Dr. Üstün,
in jail.
you have something to say?
I have this in my testimony as well. We have an unfortunate anti-terror law in Turkey. Because of the terror environment, we have a law that's quite makes it difficult to further democratization. Judicial system is still archaic, and this anti-terror law, basically, if you're praising the PKK organization, then you could be subject to detention and jail time. But this was changed very recently. Fourth reform package passed in the parliament, which basically makes the praising of the PKK organization not a crime. So going forward, that's going to help. But as Gürsel was saying, there are a lot of small-time journalists.
Over my time here, and
yes.
Mr. Ambassador, do you have something very quickly to answer that?
No,
Freedom of
as our
speech.
colleagues have said, it's been a tension. There's a great deal of information out there in Turkey that is available to the citizens, and there have been restrictions. Many of these restrictions date well before the AKP, as we've heard. The AKP has eliminated some of them and has particularly recently raised new questions.
So we have to put it in a historical perspective. I will now turn to my ranking member. I'm sorry, I'm overbet. As many questions as long as you want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask each of you individually to comment on this. I want you to cite for me, if you could, specific instances of outside influence with the demonstrations at Gezi Park. And I'll start with Ambassador Jeffrey and maybe go right across there. I want to see if this collective group here, so knowledgeable on these issues, can cite one specific example of that outside influence and who they are.
By my definition of outside influence, there was none. By the definition of some
yours,
of the people, I'll stop there.
None, Congressman.
Absolutely none whatsoever.
I repeat, absolutely not.
Yes, the third group I talked about, the HKPC, involved in the attack on the U.S. Embassy, involved in the Reyhanli attack. These are connected to the Assad regime in Syria.
And they were active participants in the
Yes.
Gezi protest. Yes, I got Mr. Gürsel.
Thank you. I have to object because every day I've been on the place, on the square, in the square, Taksim Square. I observed very closely the tents of the political groups existing in the resistance. I think the hardcore of the resistance is the uncoordinated, unorganized, middle class, new generation of the secular, modern, urban middle class.
Dr. Houston.
The second group are the are the members of some organizations. I mean,
Thank you. Dr. Houston.
PKK was there.
Yes, okay.
Other socialist groups was there, but personally, I didn't notice
Yeah.
any banner
I just
or
wanted to
anything
go back to
about
Dr. Houston
representing
for a
the
second,
DHKPC.
if I could. Doctor, that group you cited, they're domestic, aren't they? So when you say they're outside,
They have historically been supported by the Syrian regime, just like the PKK in the past, but their big, huge banner was on the Atatürk Cultural Center while CNN was broadcasting on live, and in the background you could see DHKPC's and Abdullah Öcalan's pictures up there. Technically, PKK and the government are talking, but PKK is still technically an illegal organization in Turkey.
but
The
are
Kurdish,
they a domestic group?
yes,
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
with
Thank you.
foreign ties.
Thank you. I had another question. Just to get a little more sense of the Gezi Park and what happened there, I'd like to ask Mr. Gorzel just to describe, if he could, who were the protesters that were there? Were they, diverse ethnic groups? Did they have different political backgrounds? Were they mostly men or women? Are they violent or harassing towards those who didn't support their views? We just saw here what we saw on television. I just wanted to get a sense from you, as someone firsthand. Could you describe who are those people?
Well, at the hardcore of the resistance, at Gezi Park, those people were the youngsters coming out from their homes to protest and to resist what was going on, for their liberties and for their future, for themselves. And it is typically a middle-class movement. But there were some other groups which in their past having used violence as a political tool, such as PKK, maybe other groups. But there were also many groups that were that were unease with the government, like, for example, feminists, like anarchists, like anti-capitalist Muslims, or environmentalists who do oppose staunchly to the policies of government. And but in Gezi Park, there was any incident reported. I didn't hear anything happened between those groups. There were a growing dialogue between them, and it still continues. And even the Kemalists, there were Kemalists with the heavy burden of the Kemalist Republican past. There also they have engaged political dialogue with other groups, and they have also accepted the existence of Mr. Öcalan's posters on the square.
Thank you,
at
Dr.
the end of the
You could
day.
answer this, if you want, when I ask the group just another question, if I could. There were some reports that the Turkish government response to the protests were not completely uniform, and some voices within the AK party were encouraging cooperation and calm. And at least according to some preliminary statements, however, once the Prime Minister returned from his travels, he used force against those protesters. Does this represent like a miscommunication within the party, a misreporting, or was there indeed, to your knowledge, some difference of opinion as to how to approach this within the party itself? And do you see these, if there are indeed those differences, what would be the implications going forward? I'd throw it open to anyone. Ambassador Jeffrey.
There certainly was, for example, both President Gül and Deputy Prime Minister Arınç at one point came out, apologized, and urged restraint on the part of the authorities towards the demonstrators and some understanding of them. But it goes further than that. Even Prime Minister Erdogan, when he returned, his original position was to take a moderate stance. He invited in and spent hours talking to representatives of the demonstrators. He then announced that he would adhere to the decision of the court to stay the tearing down of Gezi Park, and that if in the end the court decided the state could go forward with it, he would not do so until there would be a referendum on that. This was on Friday, a week ago Friday. And then the next day, he had a change in position, and he used force against the demonstrators, not only in Taksim Square, which is a major vehicle artery, but also in Gezi Park itself. So I think that there is a back and forth within the government that I find in some perverse way encouraging, because it shows that people are trying to figure out how do we deal with at least a large minority that disagrees with us on fundamental issues. And this is how democracies stumble forward.
Yes. Anyone else? Doctor?
The first couple of days, there was definitely a crisis management issue, but the ambassadors, what he's mentioning is correct. What happened on Sunday, however, when the police left the square, Taksim Square, and moved out of that area, moved to Dolmabahce, where the Prime Minister's office is there. So these organized illegal groups tried to storm this office, as well as they tried to do it simultaneously in Ankara. Once that was done, the Prime Minister decided these people are not there for the park, but they're organizing a sort of uprising, or what they're trying to inflame the situation and hijack the protests. So that's why you saw a hardline attitude afterwards. And there was a lot of disinformation. Incredible amount of disinformation about people being hurt, getting killed. According to one journalist's Twitter account, you could count 20 people dead in the first day. So there was a lot of inflammatory information flow, and the main news channels reported it around the clock, but they did not do live broadcast from the area. By the second day, things were out of control, and then later on, the thing really grew, people reacted to this, and there are all these different diverse groups that Gürsel was talking about.
Yeah, my time is over too, so if one of the remaining panelists could just answer that same question, that would be...
I certainly agree with Ambassador Jeffrey that there was this kind of tension and disagreement. The difficulty, it seems to me now, is that since Prime Minister Erdogan came back, changed his position, since that time he has done everything he can to reassert his view of things in this very large number of speeches he's giving, and to insist on a very perverse interpretation of the events which took place. One example that has struck me, during the events in Taksim, people naturally sought help for their injuries or for having been gassed. A group went into a mosque solely for the purpose of finding some, a secure place to be treated. Prime Minister Erdogan has described this as essentially an assault on the mosque. He claims that people ran in there with beers to desecrate the mosque. He claims that they bothered female worshipers, that they walked in there with shoes. The Imam of the mosque has declared this to be an absolutely false, publicly. But Prime Minister Erdogan returns to this over and over again in his speeches in a way
If I could interrupt too, but the purpose of the hearing is not to litigate those individual issues, but I wanted to thank all of you. I just way over my time.
Okay.
But I did get the sense of all of you, and I do think this kind of discussion is helpful. It has been helpful to the U.S. in their history to look back at themselves and have an open discourse about these things. And you're such an important ally, Turkey is, that, I hope that kind of introspective view, painful as it can be at times, is helpful. And I yield back.
Mr. Lowenthal, I believe, is next.
Well, thank you, and for educating us. I'm wondering, a little bit more about the balance that is going on in Turkey between secularism and more Islamic beliefs, and what that dynamic is like, and especially within the AKP party itself. Can you explain to us just where, for our interpretation, it seems to have been drifted more away from a secular, and yet I'd like to understand what is going on within the AKP party itself. Are they experiencing this, and are there forces to pull it in both directions within the party itself? Yes.
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal. I think it's a great question. It allows us to delve into the current polarization of Turkish society along this
Yes.
dividing line. Let me take the government's alcohol policy, on which there was a question earlier from the chairman as well. Turkey is a Muslim-majority country, and consumption of alcohol is considered a sin by some Muslims. So the regulation of consumption and sale of alcohol therefore blurs the lines between government and religion in a Muslim-majority country. It's not just a healthcare or social policy issue. It is an issue about the separation of religion and government. Therefore, the limitation of sale of alcohol or denial of alcohol licenses to stores and businesses, I think, represents a blurring of that line. I think for many Turks who would not consider the consumption of alcohol a sin or do not care that it's a sin, this is a government legislating what should be considered a sin by some into what should be a crime. And I think that is a dividing line that has been unfortunately activated in the last few years because of some of the legislation passed by the government.
Yeah. Others? This was for all the panel.
The party is a conservative democratic party, so it pursues a conservative agenda. There's no doubt about that. If it moved, secularism moved away from something, it moved away from the French style towards more US style, where you tolerate all sorts of religions and religious beliefs. The party is a very diverse party. It received 50% of the votes of country, so this is a very diverse country. It has a lot of, there is a discussion within the party. There's no doubt about that. When it comes to alcohol regulations, though, the restrictions are based on World Health Organization's suggestions. They're not, they didn't come up with them themselves, and they're actually less restrictive than those applied in this country, in the United States. And it basically regulates the, you used to be able to, you send your teenage son to buy alcohol for yourself, and they would sell alcohol in the night hours, so there is regulations adopted on those issues, but they're not, they didn't come up with them, with those regulations themselves. They're based on EU and World Health Organization guidelines.
Mr. Gersel.
Thank you. Well, according to OECD figures, in Turkey, the pure alcohol consumption per person, per adult person per year is only 1.5 liters. And Turkey is the least alcohol consuming country in the OECD, while the average is 10.5. And these measures are really overstretching measures. And then it caused the perception of advancing of an Islamic agenda by an important portion of the public. And then also Prime Minister defended the alcohol, so-called alcohol regulation by Islamic references also one time. And then according to about the transformation of the political Islam, well, I dubbed this party as a neo-Islamist, but now to be a neo-Islamist, to my opinion, you should preserve the secular system while being against the secularization of the society. But now the system is becoming more or less under the heavy pressure of an Islamic or Islamist agenda coming under the pressure for about 1 year or more under the heavy-handed approaches of Mr. Erdogan.
Dr. Fradkin?
I think some of these things appear from outside as relatively small impositions or restrictions, as was talked about earlier. And in fact, they are, and partially for the reason that was just mentioned. Very few Turks are drinkers, but there seems to be a desire on the part of the government and the party to make a particular point of this and express itself in other ways as well. For example, lately a campaign directed against couples kissing in public. So there is a sense that there's a kind of censoriousness about some of the regulations and some of the rhetoric that associates with them. And the other part of it is a large building program that has been undertaken by the government, especially to build more and more mosques, and especially a giant mosque, which will be on the Asian side of the Bosphorus.
Ambassador?
It's a very, very good question, Mr. Congressman. It's also one that gets us all on thin ice, and as you can see, we've gotten different views here, all of which I agree with, even though in some respects they're contradictory, because the subject is contradictory. I'll try, without getting into, I hope, trouble, explain this very quickly, but in a little bit of context. The United States view of secularism is a very interesting one, because we're by and large a religious country that has very strong barriers, usually not crossed, about keeping religion out of the political system for a variety of reasons, including the many different kinds of religions we have. In Turkey, there is from both sides, the secular side took a very, it was mentioned earlier, but it's an important point, the French form of laïcité or secularism, which is quite aggressive in France against the Catholic Church 200 years ago with the Revolution, and some of these ideas have passed down. In Turkey, this is manifest by the headscarf ban that was in effect for many years. And we're seeing a sort of a mirror image of this with some of the actions by the current government. And in both cases, what is seemingly missing is respect for the private sphere of people, be they religious or be they non-religious, be they followers of religious precepts or be they not too concerned about them. There's been a consistent trend, regardless of the government, over a long period of time, to challenge the right of people to do this. We see this now. We saw it 20 years ago.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and we now turn to Mr. Meeks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and to Ranking Member Keating. Let me first say that I actually come to this hearing today with democracy very heavy in my mind. I talk about the democracy here in the United States. I'll admit outright that it's from this prism of democracy that I know best, and its evolution, and that I approach the question of this hearing post. Is Turkey at a crossroads? What do recent protests mean for the democracy in the region? The democracy, our democracy here in the United States, after more than 200 years, is still working towards perfection. Yesterday, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling that gutted one of our nation's landmark civil rights, the Voting Rights Act. That ruling was devastating to communities in this country who have been fighting attempts to suppress their right to vote. The scourge and pain of the past and present de jure and de facto racism came rushing at those of us who lived through it and fight for it now. Sadly, that is and was the America that I have known. On the other hand, today, the Supreme Court issued rulings that bring our nation significantly closer to our aspirations of equality in our society. We are indeed, the point is, we are indeed still an evolving country. This hearing about Turkey, but the legacy of our evolution is instructive here, I believe. Contrary to what some have suggested, I believe that the protests in Turkey are a sign of the strengthening of the democratic engagement of civil society. Protesters have power, and they are demonstrating that they know how to use it. It is my hope for Turkey, as it is for America, that we are judged by our positive steps toward a better society, rather than the mistakes we have made along the way. For surely the United States have made mistakes also, And I don't want to be judged as a country by those mistakes. I want to be judged by the positiveness. It is also my hope that my colleagues encourage the government of Turkey to embrace positive deepening of its democracy, as were most evident in the early steps of the current governing party. Those early steps should not be overlooked nor forgotten by this committee or members of the United States Congress. A balancing of power of the military and major economic reforms toward advancing to EU accession talks, in my estimation, were no small feat. The future of the EU accession talks have already been affected by the ongoing protests, but I believe both Turkey and the EU would lose if the accession talks remained blocked. So I have great hopes for the future of Turkey. With that, I want to just focus on that for a second and ask questions, I guess, to Dr. Houston and to both Mr. Gersel, and I hear from the ambassadors also, and I don't mind if everybody pick in, but successive U.S. administrations and many members of Congress have long supported Turkey's accession to the EU. And at times, however, the United States' pressure on EU actors regarding Turkey's membership prospects have generated tension. How important is Turkey's potential accession and continuing the accession process amid current difficulties in Turkey and EU relationships? And what, if anything, can and should the United States do to continue to promote Turkey's EU accession? Dr.
I think Turkey is very grateful to the U.S. for the support it gives on EU membership, and it has pursued it strongly, and many reforms passed in Turkey thanks to EU support and funds and everything like that. But EU's its internal problems and internal questioning of whether Islam as Turkey as an Islamic country could actually be in the EU has raised questions. That question is now much bigger for the EU, and EU's internal economic problems now created a sort of several EUs, if you will. So those kind of problems are preventing progress on that front. But Turkey still considers it as a strategic goal. The president mentioned that, the prime minister and all that, all of them. Yesterday's news about the opening of the regional policy chapter was very good news on that front. And Germany has criticized the handling of these protests, but I think we will move forward there. So I'm more hopeful, but there have been serious problems. The EU stalled Turkey on those accounts.
Let's just go across and then I'll be done.
The recent incidents in Istanbul and in all over Turkey proved again that the EU, that for Turkey there is no alternative to EU perspective. The EU perspective is still the anchor for a sustainable democracy, to create a sustainable democracy for Turkey, even though there was no EU flag during the protest, etc. But it doesn't change the reality. This stalemate must be overcome, and to overcome this stalemate, maybe the US can play a facilitating role, beginning from the Cyprus question, which blocks our way, our EU perspective, and the pressure over the government from the social, from the society, and from other actors, to pursue and to stick with the EU perspective is very important at the moment.
Thank you, Congressman Meeks. I also think that Turkey's EU accession is of incredible value to Turks and also to the United States, and I think U.S. support for Turkey's accession has made that process possible. If not for that, Turkey would not be where it is today. I don't think Turkey's need for the EU is anymore on the economic front. The country has grown in leaps and bounds in the last decade, and Europe has not, and the Turks don't anymore feel that Europe is the gate to prosperity. But Europe is the gate to liberal democracy, and I think for the following reason. Turkey has, roughly speaking, two disparate halves. As Ambassador Jeffrey stated, the country's model of secularism has switched from one to the other. Turks used to subscribe to the European model of secularism, which basically meant freedom from religion in government and education. Now they've moved to the American model, which is freedom of religion in government and education. For many countries, I think one or other model works. For Turkey, you need both. This country has people of different religious persuasions and convictions and practices, although it's mostly Muslim. At the same time, I think Turkey needs, for instance, a constitution that would provide freedom of religion and freedom from religion so that secular, conservative, liberal Turks would all feel welcome in this new country. And the only way we can get there is through the anchor of European Union, which would be the soft power force to push for political liberalization so that the countries, two disparate halves, could feel that they can live together. And the road to that goes through a new constitution. And the path to that goes through the country's prize goal of European Union accession. So I think EU is the anchor of political liberalization in Turkey.
Like my colleagues, I think that it would be a very good idea. It was a good idea in the past, and it would be a good idea at present. And if the United States can move that forward, that would be all to the good. But it seems extremely unlikely under the present circumstances. On the one hand, what happened in Turkey has given those opponents of accession in the EU an excuse for denying, stopping the process, which is now stopped till October. And on the other hand, it has created for Prime Minister Erdogan, Europe as a kind of punching bag, which he's been using regularly in order to appeal to his supporters. So neither side looks like they want to actually get together at the moment, and it's hard to see how they would be brought. That would be brought forward under the present circumstances. Maybe if things calm down, or the other possibility is, it seems to me what was mentioned earlier, that the eruption of Gezi Park is the eruption to which you referred, the eruption of civil society. And if that civil society becomes stronger, and if, as appears to be the case, it really does yearn for the kinds of political forms that are characteristic of the EU, then it's more likely that it would go forward. But then it would have a clear base within Turkish politics and perhaps overcome European objections.
First, the EU accession process itself and eventual entry is a very good thing for Turkey. Secondly, as someone who's lived even longer in Europe than in Turkey, it's a good thing for Europe. Turkey, geographically, at least part of the country, by the ethnic composition of much of its population, by its history, is part of the European realm. It's economically now a powerhouse that would help the European Union in many respects. So what's the problem? And certainly, it isn't that Turkey's all that different. It has a very strong orientation towards Europe. There are millions of Turks in Germany and so forth. I think this is a very important process. The American government supports it. We get in trouble all the time with the Europeans by making these recommendations. I think we've earned the right from 1941 to 1989 and beyond to give advice to our friends and allies. They can not listen to us if they want.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
And we will ask unanimous consent. Mr. Connolly be given the rights as a ex officio member of the committee to proceed with his 5 minutes of questions. And hearing no objection, so ordered. Mr. Connolly, you may proceed.
Thank goodness Mr. Meeks couldn't hear that last part there, about objection. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to be here today as the co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus in Turkey, and I really thank you and the ranking member for your graciousness in allowing me to participate. First of all, Ambassador Jeffrey, I hear a fellow New Englander. Where are you from?
Saugus, Mass., just north of Boston.
Okay. I can talk that way too if I have to, but I don't normally. To make a point, I think to follow up on some of the points you were making, Mr. Ambassador, if one looked at the United States from 1965 through, say, 1968, very turbulent period in this country, there were riots in most major urban areas of America during that time period, were there not? You may want to verbally acknowledge, Mr. Ambassador.
They were.
And in 1968, was there not a major conflagration in the city of Chicago during the pendency of a major party convention to try to determine the next President of the United States, the head of state, that subsequently was referred to by a formal commission as a police riot? Is that not true?
That is true.
Were those incidents, I mean, could one construe fairly that with those turbulent years and those very difficult and in some cases terrible events, that somehow that proved that America was not up to its democratic ideals, or indeed its democratic institutions were false?
As one who was very involved in that period, I would say it proved that A, there were great fissures in American society at that time, and that we worked through them in different ways that proceeded on through the 70s, and that we emerged from it a stronger democracy.
I think you've just put your finger right on it. I think that's the question. Not that there are difficulties in a country, not that there are, in some cases, sometimes violent demonstrations in a democracy, though they are to be avoided if we can. But what does the country do with that dissent? Does it make it stronger, or does it, in fact, force it or encourage it to fall back on autocratic processes that hinder democratization? And it seems to me that's sort of the existential moment for Turkey right now. And I wonder if you could enlighten us, because I've heard sort of contrary messages coming from the Turkish government. Initially, Prime Minister Erdogan reacted pretty harshly to the very fact that there were any demonstrations and called demonstrators names. But then other members of his government, the President himself, and I think you pointed out, or somebody pointed out, a deputy minister, actually there were noises about apologies for the overreaction of police and a statement of respect for the sincerity of the demonstrators. There was hope after those statements that when Prime Minister Erdogan returned to Ankara, that his words might echo some of that conciliatory rhetoric. They seem not to. I wonder, Ambassador Jeffrey, if you can help us a little bit sort of divine what are we to conclude from these mixed messages coming from officials of the Turkish government with respect to the import of these demonstrations?
I yield to some of the people here who know the country better than I, but I would say that we have another example. Just yesterday, not only did President Obama speak with the Prime Minister, but the U.S. statement issued after it, the Prime Minister also described the situation in Turkey. The two leaders discussed the importance of nonviolence and of the rights to free expression, assembly, and a free press. Such statements are usually, to one or another degree, jointly, not only do they reflect the truth, but they usually reflect a certain understanding, at least, if not agreement, before it goes out. So I would take this as another step moving back. Again, we get to your first question, sir, which is, this is a very tumultuous movement, I think, forward. I could be wrong, but I would like to ask the others.
Certainly. Other members of the panel wish to comment?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Franken and Dr. Kagapti.
Appetite. I think that, it's very useful to draw the analogy that you did, or the comparison anyway. And it certainly could be the case that this is the kinds of results or progress in democratic life will result from this explosion. The obstacles to it, it seems to me, are a couple. One is, was referred to earlier by some of my colleagues, I think in particular Mr. Kurcel, that we had the benefit in the 60s, of which I remember extremely well, of certain institutions, and also the rotation of the parties, which permitted people to sort of say how they wanted to go in the future, and also to restrain the passions that were are characteristic of democratic life. The question is whether Turkey has the conditions for the restraint of those passions, or the way a means for expressing them in its political life. And that, I'm not saying it doesn't, but this is certainly new, and it's not clear that it does.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. I agree with my friend and colleague, Ambassador Jeffrey, that this is Turkey moving forward for the following reasons. It has become, in the last decade, largely thanks to sound economic policies implemented by the AKP government, a majority middle-class society for the first time in history. By the end of this decade, about 80% of Turks will be classified as middle class. What is more importantly, Turkey is about to attain universal literacy, and this will be ever for a large Muslim majority country in human history, again, at first. These two developments are irreversible. They represent a society that has become too mature, too middle class, too literate, too connected to the world to fit into one-size-fits-all straitjacket conservatism. That is why I think you're seeing an outburst of anger on the streets, as some of my panelists have indicated. But I think what you're seeing is beyond that anger. What was interesting in Istanbul the last month is first that you had a pretty significant pro-environmental movement that tried to save a park from being converted into a shopping mall. People care for the trees. That would not have been the case in Turkey 10 years ago. That is a product of a decade of growth and prosperity and middle-class values, respect for the environment, that has been born out of the AKP's success. What is more important is that when the police cracked down on the pro-environment sit-in, in the middle of the night, 2 a.m. in the morning, hundreds of thousands of people came onto the streets to defend the rights of those other people to protest. I think that's a sign of maturity. It indicates that people are saying, I may not agree with what they're doing, but they have the right to assembly and free speech. And I think that represents a way forward for the country, because the country is arriving at a point of a large middle class which demands respect for individual freedoms, including freedom of assembly, association, media, expression, and respect for individual space as well as the environment.
Before we proceed, my time is up, and it's entirely up to the chairman whether he wishes to allow additional comment. I thank the chair.
Well, I think in Turkey, where there is no real checks and balances, no effective or efficient opposition, no free press, at the end of the day, I can say this, this social explosion shake the dynamics or statics of the government, political statics of the government, and show the government their limits. And then it must be understood. The limits for Mr. Erdogan's power has been drawn in Taksim on the 1st of June. And then these people, now they are continuing to their social movement without the support of the extremist groups in parks, at their homes, and in many parts of the social life. They are stripped from them. And then these people, the middle class, the urban, secular middle class, as Mr. Çağatay has said, they are connected to the world. And at this age, where there is this highly educated, the new middle class term of, I use the term as to remark that they are the wage earners, and they are very skilled people. They are the potential owners of the EU project of Turkey. But if the project is offered to them in a convincing way, because the project is not now actually is in the deep freeze, and then this is and at this age to finalize, the social engineering is impossible. This is one last message that this government or Mr. Erdogan himself has to get from this social explosion.
And to top it off, Dr. Ustan.
Mr. Chairman, your earlier question, did you expect it? And I said yes with some objections. The reason was that there's a context to all of this. AK Party has had all these successes at the ballot box, and now it's trying to tackle the long sort of burning issues such as the Kurdish question and a new civilian constitution. These have also created discontent. There are people who are not happy about the Kurdish settlement process, and they're not sure what's happening, and etc. But the tension was there, so we could tell that this tension had to come out somehow. And also there's discontent about the Syria policy. But the reason the language changed over time and you hear mixed messages is that evolution of the protests. don't forget, Prime Minister met with the protesters in 2 different meetings, and he said that I understand your concerns, and the government issued an apology as well. But he was directing his comments about groups who want to occupy the park, not just protest, but occupy, and then continuously protest whenever they want it. So there he had to draw the line and say, there's the rule of law, and you have to abide by the rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've had some very thought-provoking testimony today. Just a few thoughts in closing. There were some expressions of optimism that I noted even from the beginning, where we talked about the development of a middle class in Turkey, that what perhaps these demonstrations reflect the development of a middle class who, I ain't going to take it anymore, or something that could lead, as we talked about, to an actual greater demand of the population for democratic principles and respect for their rights. So, and we heard that expression from Mr. Meeks as well. And so that Mr. Meeks was sort of mirroring that testimony about a strong middle class. And we would hope that Turkey uses this episode of turmoil as a vehicle to move closer rather than farther away from democratic government. And because, as Mr. Connolly pointed out, we have had instances like this in the United States, and some of the turmoil that we've gone through have helped us make decisions that needed to be made, and we needed to change direction. And so turmoil is either going to sign as a growing pain, which is an indication of past progress, or it could be seen also that past progress is in jeopardy. So we're watching this very closely. And one last thought is that years ago, when I was a young man, I found myself in Istanbul, and I was staying in a 50-cent a night hotel, I might add, and it was quite an experience. And I decided that I wanted to swim between Europe and Asia. And in fact, the real truth of the matter is I decided I was going to do that because I knew it would impress women. And I needed all the leverage I could get.
Did it?
But what happened is I went down, I found a spot that looked like it was the closest between the areas there between Europe and Asia and the Bosporus there. And I started to sort of get my I had my swimming suit underneath my pants there, and I started getting ready to jump in. And I was 20 years old then, and a young fellow about 5, 6 years older than me, a Turkish young man, came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to swim between Europe and Asia." And he said, "Are you out of your mind?" And I said, "No." And he says, "This is very treacherous water here. He says, I'll tell you what, my friend and I will row beside you in our little boat." They had a little rowboat there. Thank God they did. I would have panicked 3/4 of the way, because it is really cold and the water is very treacherous there. There are whirlpools and things. And knowing that they were rowing beside me gave me the confidence to keep going. And I actually made the journey between Europe and Asia. My recommendation, and I will just say this, that we should remember that during the Cold War and during that experience that I had with myself right there, it couldn't have been better a situation than to have a strong Turkish person as my friend right next to me. And that's the way we should look in the future as well. We need to have the Turkish people beside us as friends, and and friends give advice to one another, and our advice now is to try to reconcile any differences that you have and that have been brought up by this turmoil, and use the turmoil that we've experienced in Turkey as a means to make things better rather than as a means to attack one's enemies. And if we do that, Turkey will end up a stronger country for it, and the United States will be better off as well, because we'll have Turks right next to us rowing the boat to make sure we're safe. So thank you all very much. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. Tebrikler. Şey için mi, yani bunun için mi